stripped naked, his best friend's blood and entrails smeared across his body. This was the horrifying reality John Colter faced. Before him, hundreds of warriors. Behind him, the vast, unforgiving wilderness. How does a man escape such a grim fate, outnumbered and unarmed? Colter's run wasn't just a desperate bid for survival. It was the birth of a legend, a chilling testament to human endurance against impossible odds. What happened in those frantic moments that seared this tale into history? In the winter of 1809, on a crisp morning in southwestern Montana near the Three Forks of the Missouri River, John Colter and John Potts, both veterans of the 1804-1806 Lewis and Clark expedition, found themselves navigating familiar yet perilous territory. Following the conclusion of that federally mandated exploration of the Louisiana Purchase lands, a venture commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, Colter and Potts had opted to remain. Their objective was fur trapping, primarily beaver pelts, a commodity of significant economic value in the early 19th century. Colter, whose skills as a hunter had been noted during the expedition, along with Potts, possessed a rare familiarity with this region for men not native to it. Their current enterprise involved paddling a dugout canoe down the Jefferson River. The canoe was laden with beaver skins, the tangible result of their trapping efforts. The fur trade, while a burgeoning industry, was fraught with inherent dangers, notably the frequent and often violent interactions with Native American tribes whose lands the trappers traversed. Their presence in this specific area, recognized as Blackfoot territory, was not without recent precedent. Only the year prior, in 1808, Colter and Potts had experienced a hostile encounter. They were guiding a party of Flathead and Crow natives on a trapping excursion through lands contested by the Blackfoot, the Neetsitapi, who were traditional enemies of both the Crow and Flathead. The Blackfoot, a powerful confederation of Algonquian-speaking peoples, were known for their staunch defense of their territory against outsiders, including Euro-American trappers and rival tribes. During that 1808 skirmish, Colter had sustained a leg wound, though it had not proven incapacitating. Despite this prior conflict and the injury Colter had suffered, the two men were now, in the winter of 1809, once again venturing into Blackfoot lands, intending to set their traps and continue their trade. As Colter and Potts maneuvered their canoe around a bend in the Jefferson River, the waterway suddenly opened to a scene that demanded their immediate attention. Lining the riverbanks were hundreds of Blackfoot warriors. Estimates suggest a force of between 500 and 800 men, an overwhelming number arrayed against the two trappers. As their dugout drifted closer to the bank, the Blackfoot warriors issued a clear directive calling out for them to bring their watercraft ashore at once. The situation presented Colter and Potts with a critical decision, the outcome of which would carry immediate and severe consequences. Colter, drawing perhaps on his experiences in negotiations with various native groups during the Lewis and Clark expedition, where understanding cultural customs and parley tactics was essential, made a rapid assessment. He decided to comply with the demand. His calculation was likely that the Blackfoot primarily sought their furs and supplies. Such a loss, while an inconvenience and a financial setback, was not, in his judgment, necessarily a fatal one. He would go ashore. Potts, however, reached a different conclusion. He declared he would not leave the canoe. His reasoning may have been rooted in a belief that he maintained a more defensible position, or perhaps greater safety, on the water. This assessment would prove to be a fatal misjudgment. Colter steered the canoe towards the riverbank. The moment the hull touched the shore, Blackfoot warriors seized him. He was pulled from the canoe, his weapons taken, and he was stripped of all his clothing. The contents of their canoe, the valuable beaver pelts, and their trapping gear were promptly confiscated and distributed among the warriors. With John Colter now captive, naked and disarmed on the riverbank, the Blackfoot warriors turned their attention back to John Potts, who remained stubbornly in the dugout canoe some distance from the shore. A renewed command was issued from the bank. Potts was ordered again to come ashore. He watched the scene Colter surrounded, the warriors agitated. Potts shouted his refusal across the water. His defiance was unequivocal. In response to Potts's continued defiance, a Blackfoot warrior stepped forward from the crowd on the bank. He raised his trade musket, a smoothbore flintlock, took aim at the figure in the canoe, and fired. The heavy lead ball struck Potts, tearing into his hip. The impact visibly rocked him, but he did not immediately go down. Instead, Potts reacted with swift aggression. Still in the canoe, he grabbed his own flintlock rifle. Despite the grievous wound, he leveled the barrel, sighted on the warrior who had shot him, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the warrior on the bank crumpled to the ground, killed by Potts's return fire. The death of one of their own instantly transformed the mood of the Blackfoot assembly from agitated to enraged. A furious volley of projectiles erupted from the riverbank, directed at the lone figure in the canoe. Arrows arced through the air, thudding into the wooden sides of the dugout and into Potts himself. Musket balls from numerous trade guns joined the barrage, splintering the canoe and further riddling Potts's body. Under this overwhelming fusillade, Potts's resistance ceased. His life was extinguished amidst a storm of lead and wood. Once it was clear Potts was dead, several warriors waded into the river and dragged the bullet-riddled, arrow-studded canoe, with Potts's lifeless body still inside, to the shore. The actions that followed were a stark illustration of Blackfoot customs in warfare, particularly concerning defeated enemies. Such practices served to display dominance, to inflict ultimate disgrace upon the fallen foe, and perhaps to transfer spiritual power or to assuage the grief and anger from their own loss. As the warriors divided Potts's meager possessions and the remaining contents of the canoe, a more brutal process began on his corpse. His body was pulled from the canoe and then dismembered. Warriors with knives and tomahawks fell upon the remains. His hands were severed. His abdomen was cut open, and his entrails were pulled out. His liver was excised, and his testicles were cut away. For John Colter, stripped bare and held fast by several warriors, this was not a distant spectacle. Each time a part of Potts's body was hacked free, it was brought over to where Colter stood. The warm, bloody tissue, a severed hand, a length of intestine, the still quivering liver, was then deliberately and roughly rubbed onto Colter's face, his chest, his arms. The gore of his longtime companion and business partner coated his skin. He was forced to endure not only the psychological torment of witnessing the mutilation of his friend, but also the visceral physical defilement. This ritualistic degradation served to heighten Colter's terror and to underscore his utter helplessness. The Blackfoot account from the Missouri Gazette, published in 1810, and based on Colter's own recounting, stands as one of the earliest documented records of these events. Colter, covered in the blood and viscera of his comrade, could only assume that a similar, if not worse, fate awaited him. He stood, watching, waiting for his own execution to commence. Following the dismemberment of Potts and the ritualistic humiliation of Colter, a brief consultation took place among the elder warriors and leaders present. The specific details of their discussion are unknown, but its outcome directly concerned Colter's immediate future. When the talk concluded, one of the chiefs approached Colter. Through signs and perhaps a few words of broken English or French understood by trappers, Colter was asked a peculiar question: was he a good runner? Colter was a man known for his physical prowess. Tall, lean, and hardened by years in the wilderness, his stamina and strength were well established, at least among those who knew him from the Lewis and Clark expedition and his subsequent time as a mountain man. However, in this dire circumstance, with his life hanging by the slenderest of threads, Colter perceived a potential, albeit slim, avenue for survival within the question. He surmised that some form of deadly game was being proposed. Honesty about his running ability would likely gain him nothing. Therefore, he replied through gestures or words that he was, in fact, a very poor runner, slow and easily winded. His response seemed to satisfy the Blackfoot leader. Colter was then led by this chief some distance away from the main group of warriors, perhaps 300 or 400 yards out onto the open plain that stretched away from the Jefferson River. The chief then pointed towards the prairie, a vast expanse of grassland interspersed with sagebrush, cottonwood groves along distant watercourses, and the occasional rocky outcrop or low rise. He gestured for Colter to run. Without hesitation, John Colter turned and sprinted. He ran with every ounce of strength he possessed, his bare feet pounding against the cold, hard-packed earth and sharp prairie grasses. His objective was singular: to gain as much distance, as much of a head start as he possibly could before the pursuit began. This desperate flight would become known as Colter's Run, an episode that has since evolved into one of the most enduring survival narratives in the history of the American West. Scarcely had Colter begun his sprint when a chorus of war cries erupted from the assembled Blackfoot warriors. A large group of them, with estimates varying from a dozen to several score, armed with bows, quivers full of arrows, and lances or spears, immediately gave chase. Colter pushed himself relentlessly. For several miles he maintained a near all-out pace, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. The terrain was unforgiving. Open prairie offered little cover, but it was also broken by ravines, small streams that had to be leaped or waded, and patches of thorny brush. The physical exertion was immense. After covering this initial distance at maximum effort, blood began to stream from his nostrils, a common physiological response to extreme physical stress. His entire body was now caked not only with the drying blood and entrails of John Potts, but also with his own fresh blood, sweat, and the dust of the prairie. Some accounts estimate Colter would cover nearly 200 miles in the ensuing days, naked, without food, water, or shelter, through rugged country and freezing conditions. His desperate burst of speed, however, had achieved its initial aim. He had managed to create a significant gap between himself and the main body of his pursuers. Most of the Blackfoot warriors had fallen behind. Yet, one warrior, exceptionally swift and tenacious, had kept pace. This individual had steadily closed the distance throughout the grueling run and was now gaining on Colter with alarming speed, his spear held ready for a killing thrust. Colter could hear the warrior's footsteps and labored breathing closing in. He knew he could not outrun this particular pursuer for much longer. Just as the warrior was almost upon him, close enough to strike, the Blackfoot man, himself pushed to the brink of exhaustion, stumbled as he lunged forward to impale Colter with his spear. In his fall, the warrior landed heavily on his own outstretched weapon, the wooden shaft snapping in two beneath his weight. Seeing his opportunity, Colter, with a surge of adrenaline, spun around. He seized the pointed end of the broken spear shaft, the part still armed with its sharpened stone or metal head. Before the fallen warrior could recover or rise, Colter lunged and drove the improvised weapon into the man's body, killing him. Wasting no time, Colter quickly stripped the warrior's single buffalo hide blanket from his corpse. This blanket, a seemingly small acquisition, would prove to be of critical importance for Colter's survival during the freezing nights that lay ahead. With this meager spoil of his life-or-death struggle, Colter resumed his flight, running on. He covered another 5 miles, the remaining pursuer still somewhere behind him, before he reached the welcome sight of a substantial beaver dam spanning a wide, cold river. Reaching the river, John Colter plunged into the icy water without a second thought. The shock of the cold was severe, but his immediate survival depended on evading the pursuing Blackfoot warriors. He spotted the large beaver dam, a natural fortification of logs, branches, and mud. Like a beaver seeking refuge, he dove deep and swam underwater, navigating beneath the complex structure of the dam. He surfaced inside the lodge, a dark, confined space, but one that offered concealment. The beaver lodge, built by the animals for their own protection, now served as Colter's sanctuary. He remained hidden within the damp confines of the beaver lodge as evening approached. Soon the remaining Blackfoot pursuers reached the riverbank. They had tracked him to the water's edge. For hours, Colter listened as they moved up and down the banks of the river, their voices audible, their forms occasionally visible through small gaps in the dam's construction. They searched, probed the area with their lances, and waited, expecting him to eventually reveal himself or attempt to cross. Colter remained still, submerged partially in the cold water, controlling his breathing, every sense alert to the danger outside. As darkness fully enveloped the landscape, the Blackfoot warriors, unable to locate their quarry and likely concluding he had drowned or somehow slipped away in the fading light, finally abandoned their search and departed. When he was certain they had gone, Colter carefully emerged from the beaver lodge. He was alone, naked, save for the warrior's blanket he had acquired, and deep within hostile territory. Before him lay an arduous journey. For the next 11 days he traveled, moving mostly at night to avoid detection, across a rugged, unforgiving landscape. He walked, climbed, and crawled, his bare feet cut and bruised by the rocky terrain and sharp vegetation. The late autumn or early winter nights brought freezing temperatures, and the thin blanket offered minimal protection. Hunger became a constant companion. He survived by foraging for edible roots and vitum wild, Sorolea esculenta, and whatever other sparse vegetation he could identify as sustenance. His leg wound from the previous year's encounter may have troubled him, and the physical toll of the run and subsequent exposure was immense. Despite the incredible hardship, Colter pressed on. His knowledge of the wilderness, gained during his years with Lewis and Clark and as a trapper, was crucial. He navigated by the stars and the lay of the land, pushing himself toward the nearest known point of relative safety. Finally, after 11 days of this harrowing trek, exhausted and emaciated, he reached a trading post on the Little Bighorn River. This outpost was likely Fort Raymond, also known as Manuel's Fort, established by Manuel Lisa's Missouri Fur Company. Here, among fellow trappers and traders, John Colter found safety. At Fort Raymond, John Colter slowly began to recover from his terrible ordeal. The physical deprivations had taken their toll, but he gradually regained his strength. The psychological impact of what he had endured, witnessing Potts's brutal death and his own narrow escape, can only be conjectured. Remarkably, after a period of recuperation, Colter's spirit for the mountain life was not entirely extinguished. He made a decision to return to the wilderness, even venturing back into the general region of Blackfoot territory. With new business partners, he made an attempt to establish a new trapping operation and build a small fort. This return to the mountains, however, was brief and ended in further tragedy. While away from their camp checking trap lines, Colter and his party were again targeted. Upon returning to their encampment, they discovered that Blackfoot warriors had attacked. All the men who had remained at the camp, a total of 17 individuals, according to some accounts, had been killed. This second devastating encounter with the Blackfoot, resulting in such a significant loss of life among his companions, finally convinced Colter to leave the mountains. He departed the Rockies, reportedly vowing never to return to the life of a trapper in those perilous regions. Colter journeyed east and settled in Missouri. There he sought a different existence. He married a woman named Sally, and they had a son, Hiram Colter. He established a farm near what is now New Haven, Missouri, and lived the life of a settler. The extreme physical hardships he had endured during his years in the West, including the famous run, likely had lasting effects on his health. In 1812, with hostilities brewing between the United States and Great Britain, John Colter enlisted in Nathan Boone's company of mounted rangers, serving briefly in the War of 1812. The exact date of John Colter's death is subject to some historical debate. While some sources suggest the 22nd of November, 1813, the more widely accepted date, supported by multiple records, including probate documents, is May 7, 1812. He is believed to have died from jaundice. John Colter's experiences, particularly his incredible escape, quickly became known. His story, recounted by those who knew him and eventually published,